It's simple questions. It's interesting. This is the dialogue between Jesus and this teacher in the law with simple questions. But that last question that seems simple, who is my neighbor, actually gets a really complex answer. The answer is that's when Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan. So looking at this story, there's this expert in the law. He's a guy who knows his stuff, a guy who's really educated. He's dedicated his life to studying Scripture, a guy who really literally has all the answers. He knows his stuff well. And so he goes and asks Jesus, what do I got to do to inherit eternal life? And I like the way Jesus teaches. He basically says, well, what do you think? You probably have the answer anyway. What's the answer? What is the answer to this question? And in short, the guy basically says, well, you got to love God, love others. Love God, love your neighbor. And Jesus says, yeah, correct. Good answer. You got the knowledge right. You got the headspace right. But you need to do it. Go and do it. Go and live that out. Do this and you will live. Which that actually could be taken as an insult, right? It could be taken as a, you got the head right, but you're not actually living it. And so this guy, feeling a little insulted, kind of wants to justify himself. That's what the text says. The text says he wants to justify himself, which basically means he wants to show that he's right. He wants to show that his behavior is right, that he's correct. And in so doing, if he shows that he's right and that he's correct, then he doesn't have to change. And a lot of times that's why we want to justify ourselves. That's why we want to be right, is we don't want to have to change the way we live. We don't want to have to change our behavior. So we want to find a way to justify what we are doing. So he's trying to say, as we think about owning our responsibility, he's trying to figure out a way to communicate, I've met my responsibility. I've met my faith obligations. I've done my duty. I've done what God requires of me. I am justified. I don't need to change. And often, rather than in our own individual lives, rather than accepting responsibility, sometimes what we would prefer to do is justify ourselves so that we don't have to change. So he's trying to justify himself by asking, well, who's my neighbor? He wants a real clear answer on who his neighbor is so that he can say, check, done it. Love my neighbor. I'm good. I love God. I love my neighbor. I can keep doing everything I'm doing and live my life just how I've been living it. And the answer he would expect would be a simple answer. Something along the lines of, your neighbor is your fellow countryman. Your neighbor is basically the guy like you. Your neighbor is the guy with your religion, and you may have some philosophical differences. You may disagree about some things, but it's still the people of your blood. Still a son of Abraham. Still someone who mostly agrees with your worldview. And so he's hoping for that answer that everybody would expect, and he can say, check, done, I'm living it. But instead of giving that answer, Jesus tells what is arguably the deepest, most powerful, and most provocative parable, the parable of the Good Samaritan. And if you haven't read it, you need to. To me, it is just loaded with all kinds of really cool theological value. There's so many cool messages in there, and it's in Luke 10. I'll give you guys the quick version. And as we do this, one of the things with these parables is that they're analogies, and there's a lot of different things you can do with them. And one kind of thing I want you to approach this parable with is thinking about if we're going to kind of superimpose characters here. There's this guy on the road between Jerusalem and Jericho who gets jumped. He gets beat up, and he can't help himself. And I think when Jesus is telling this story to this expert in the law, he wants this expert in the law to identify with the guy who got jumped. He wants to put himself in that person's shoes. So it's almost as if he's saying, all right, hey, think about this. You're going to Jericho, and you get jumped. You get beat up, you get robbed, and you're sitting there, and you can't move, and you can't help yourself. You are in a position where you can no longer take responsibility for yourself. That happens sometimes. Sometimes we all find ourselves in positions where we want to take responsibility for ourselves, but for some reason we can't. And in this case, this guy got jumped, he got beat up, he got taken for everything he has. And so he's sitting there waiting on the road, and here comes a priest, a holy man, a man of God, a man who knows the scriptures well. So you better believe he's going to live them, right? He's going to live out the scriptures. And so this beat up guy sees him coming, and he's thinking, oh, thank goodness I'm saved. Here comes this man. But he just walks on by. Well within his rights. His job is to take care of the temple. His job is to be a mediator between man and God. He's got religious responsibilities to do. If he goes and helps this guy who's been jumped on the ground, he'll become unclean. And then he can't do his job. He's well within his rights to not help this man. It's not his responsibility. His responsibility is at the temple. So kind of a dud on that one. But then next Levite comes up. And he's thinking, okay, the beat up guy on the ground thinking, all right, surely this guy's not going to just abandon me also. The Levite, he's used to serving. He's used to doing job. He's used to doing the grunt task. He'll help me. But the Levite just walks on past him too. Doesn't help him. Maybe the Levite's thinking, I don't know who that guy is. It's not my job. It's not my responsibility. I don't know why he got jumped. Maybe he deserved it. Maybe he was asking for it. Maybe he got what was coming to him. That's not my job. It's not my responsibility. And so he keeps walking too. And I just wanted you to stop and think for a moment, like, when Jesus is telling this story and people are watching and listening, how, shameful it is. I was actually talking about this parable with some friends the other day, and we were talking about how, if we were in a modern day situation, would we stop? And we were all trying to say, oh, yeah, I would stop. Oh, yeah, I would do it. And because we were really we know how shameful it is to not stop and help that stranger. We all know we all feel this obligation there. And so the people listening to Jesus tell this story are pretty shocked. It's pretty provocative because it's basically saying, hey, those really holy, good people, the really high up people who are real religious and know God well, they're really not doing the right thing here. And so then the third person comes up, this time a Samaritan, someone who is, kind of an ethnic half-breed, a religious half-breed, antagonistic toward the people of Israel, and the feeling's mutual. They do not like each other. And it's kind of weird that he's this far south. He's kind of out of place. You don't see him around here very often. But for whatever reason, he shows up. And our beat-up, jumped guy on the ground, if he can see him approaching, he's probably thinking, oh, my luck just got way worse. Because this Samaritan, if I got anything left to take, he's going to take it. He's going to take advantage of me. He's a scummy person. But instead of all those people, it's the Samaritan who stops, who makes space, who takes risks. Because to even stop and help this guy, one, you're going to become unclean. Two, there might be other robbers waiting up in the hills to jump you. It might be a trap. But he stops and he helps this man. And he is not responsible for this man. He's not a fellow countryman. The other two were fellow countrymen. The other two were they shared some religious duty. They shared some religious similarities. Maybe the guys passing by would be in more of the Sadducees crowd, and the guy who's jumped, if we're identifying with the man who is asking Jesus what he's got to do to be saved, maybe he's a Pharisee. So there'd be some differences. There'd be a little bit of antagonism, but you're still my brother. But this is a Samaritan. No obligations to this beat-up man on the ground whatsoever. Not family, not countrymen, not from the same faith religion. But the Samaritan has that, well, if not me, then who? Type of attitude. The priest and the Levite, who were technically more responsible for this guy on the ground, they didn't do their job. They didn't do their responsibility. But the Samaritan steps in and does, in which, when Jesus is telling this story, this is just a shocking plot twist, right? The Samaritan is the good guy in the story. The Samaritan is going beyond taking personal responsibility, but he's taking responsibility for someone who no one else will. He's taking responsibility for someone who can't take care of themselves. Look, that is one of the biggest tenets of Christianity right there. That is one of the things that separates Christians from the rest of the world, in theory. is we take responsibility for the people who can't take responsibility for themselves. And so Jesus tells this story, and he says to this Pharisee who was asking, this expert in the law, he says, well, who is the neighbor? Who is his neighbor? And this expert in the law says, oh, the Samaritan. Oh. You almost got me there, Jesus. The guy who showed mercy. He couldn't even say Samaritan. That's how much the antagonism between these two groups are. He can't even say the Samaritan is the good guy in the story. And so really, the point Jesus is making is, hey, the neighbor is the people who are going to show mercy. But he's also really saying it doesn't matter who. This guy really wanted to hear Jesus say, your neighbor is the people who are just like you. But instead what Jesus is saying is, well, your neighbor might even be a Samaritan. It might be, it's anybody. And which would be a hard pill to swallow for this guy. And like I said, there's a lot of great messages in the story of the Good Samaritan. I feel like we're not going to do it complete justice. But what I want you to hear this morning is, last week we talked about like taking personal responsibility for your own actions. That's really important. And we really struggle with owning that sometimes. But then the next step, the next level of responsibility is taking responsibility when others won't. Even if it's not completely your job, even if it's 5% your job, 5% your responsibility, but really there's someone else who, it's really on them. But sometimes when no one else is doing it, we just need to step up and take that responsibility. Thinking about Garrett and Paige, that's, as young parents, that's one of the first times where you're like, I have this little human who can't take responsibility for themselves, and I'm in charge. That's intense. That's difficult. But there's always times in people's lives where there's someone who can't take responsibility, or who maybe it's because they're a baby and can't. Maybe there's other reasons. Maybe there's less noble reasons. But sometimes we have to take responsibility when others won't. And I do like that. I use the picking up the trash analogy with the kids up here. I was a youth minister for a long time, and I've subbed a lot, substitute teach. And the scenario happens so often where there's a piece of trash left out or a drink. In the youth house, it's drinks a lot, right, Clay? We were youth ministers / janitors. But there's a drink left out. And I'll say, hey, someone needs to pick up that drink. That drink's left out. And then, aren't always as noble as our children's ministry kids. Usually everybody's like, oh, that's not mine. I didn't do that. I didn't leave that out. That's not my responsibility. That's not my job. Someone else needs to take responsibility for their actions. And they're not wrong. They're not wrong. And I don't know why they left out the drink. Maybe they're entitled and think people should clean up after them. Probably not. They probably just had the drink out and were like, ooh, fun, foosball. Or all the drinks look the same. Maybe they thought it was someone else's drink. I don't know. But there's always one person who says, I'll clean it up. It's not mine, but I'll take care of it. And that person's a leader. They're taking responsibility where nobody else will. And it's really something pretty simple, right? And it's humble, and I like that. I like that they're like, this doesn't make me feel any less to do this. I can do this. But there's a lot of things like that I've seen at church. I know one time we were in the communion room here, and all the communion trays were still out, and someone came in, and they're like, I don't know why no one sees this and doesn't just think, hey, take these in here and put them up here. And I remember thinking like, oh, yeah, maybe I should have done that. I never really thought. There are some things that just happen, that someone just takes responsibility and does, and it hasn't really been assigned to anybody. Someone just takes care of it. The other day, I was getting ready for church, and someone said, hey, Brady, there's a roach in here you need to pick up. And I hate roaches. They are gross. And my first thought was like, that's not my responsibility. I'm a preacher. I shouldn't have to do it. I didn't really think that, but I was thinking, I don't want to do that. That isn't my responsibility. But then I thought a little bit more about it, and I was like, well, whose responsibility is it? Are we just going to call up the church janitor? We don't have one of those. And it's like, well, if not me, then who? So I'm hoping nobody watches as I get 15 paper towels and pick it up and put it away. But sometimes you just got to take responsibility. And as much as that thing wasn't totally my responsibility, it kind of was, right? It's kind of all of our responsibility. Kind of everybody's responsibility in a sense. So I want you guys to think about there's this sense of taking on responsibility that is maybe not yours, but is collectively all of ours. I promise I'm going somewhere with this. I've noticed maybe the past couple of years in the NFL, they're really letting them get away with the celebrations, right? You know, if a defense gets a turnover, there's like a whole song and dance, right? I don't really like that. I kind of find it annoying. But one thing I do like in like NFL celebrations is when people have like signature celebrations they do. Have you guys noticed this? So like, or in college football, one of my old favorites was this one. You remember this one? Aggie fans cashing in. Johnny Manziel's cashing in on all that hard work is what he said that meant. Now the only thing Johnny Manziel is cashing in on is Netflix specials, which is probably a lot of money. Cam Newton did the Superman. Remember ripping the shirt like Superman? Anybody remember these? All right, I feel like I'm digging deep here. All right, Cowboys fans. Jeremy knows. Cowboys fans. Feed me. Anybody? Zeke Elliott saying, "Feed me the ball" after he gets that first down. I like these celebrations. But one that I'm hearing a lot more recently is they'll yell, "I'm him. I'm him." They do it in basketball more. But let's see, the Cincinnati Bengals, Joe Burrow yelled, "I'm him," the other day. And it's kind of a new trash talk, but it's cool. It's as if they're saying, who is going to step up and lead this team? Who's going to put this team on their backs and win this game? Who is going to be the guy? Who is going to be the leader to go in and make things happen? I'm him. I'm the guy. Now, I think maybe that's bad grammar. I think maybe it's I'm he. But I'm not going to go tell Micah Parsons that, okay? But I like this attitude of I'm going to step up. I'm going to do more than asked. I'm going to do, maybe some of my teammates aren't pulling their weight. Maybe they're missing blocks, but I'm going to be the one who's going to come in and I'm going to take responsibility and I'm going to win this game. I'm him. And so I want you to think about today, where in your life do you need to step up and be the leader who takes responsibility? Where do you need to say, I am him or I am her, I'm going to do this? To not be the person on the sideline. I think a lot of times, we're all guilty of being the person on the sideline, waiting around and saying, somebody should do their job. Someone should take care of this situation. But we're just sitting back thinking, it's not my job, it's not my responsibility. Where in your life do you need to take responsibility that may not be necessarily yours, but that you need to step into? And like I said, those small things, picking up trash, picking up a roach, moving the communion trays, they're really small. But I think making those habits of taking responsibility for your environment, for your church, for your house, for your yard, for your church parking lot, those little things, I think they have big implications. I think they are transformative. They make you someone who's not entitled. They make you someone who's responsible for you, for your community, for others. And honestly, like I said, these things, taking care of your church, it is within your realm of responsibility. It's easy to step back and say, well, someone else is more in charge, a staff member's more in charge, a deacon's more in charge. But sometimes we just need to take responsibility. I remember growing up in youth group, there was kind of a leadership vacuum. And I remember guys saying, like, I don't want to have to, like, be the one to have to, like, do the devos and say all the prayers. But you know what? I'm going to do it. I'm going to step in and do that. And sometimes that's what we need. And I've been blessed to have leaders like that when I was the youth minister in here. I mean, it's the same thing. There are things here that you may think that's not within my skill set. But I'm going to step up and lead because I know that's a need here. And so I want you to think, who's within your sphere of influence that may need help, that may need encouragement, that may need some attention, that you're thinking like, someone should really help that person. Maybe it's someone, maybe someone else knows them better. Maybe it's more someone else's responsibility. But if it's not being met, maybe you need to take responsibility there. Maybe you've been waiting on someone to help mow someone's lawn or befriend them or help them financially and nobody's doing it. Well, maybe it's time for you to step in. Maybe there's a gaping problem that you've seen in church. Maybe there's a gaping issue you've seen at Westgate and you're kind of waiting for someone should really do something about this. Well, maybe you're right. And maybe there's someone more responsible than you, but it's not happening. Maybe you need to get the ball rolling. Maybe it's time for you to take responsibility. Maybe you've seen an issue in a friend's life that you keep hoping they're going to fix, and you keep thinking, like, it's not my place. It's not my place to involve myself in this way. But if it's just not happening, maybe it is. Maybe you need to take responsibility. Maybe you need to help your friend there. Maybe there's a problem with people at work. Or maybe there's an issue you see in a friend's marriage where you've been saying, it's not my place and I'm going to stay out of it and I don't want to involve myself, but it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. Well, no one else is taking responsibility and you see the issue. Maybe it's time to step in. Maybe it's time to take some responsibility. And so is my prayer for our congregation, that God shows us, that God shows you this week. One, like we talked about last week, where you need to take responsibility in your own individual life. I think that's something that sounds simple and obvious, but we're not always good at it. But then two, where is there a leadership vacuum in your life that you need to fill? Where do you need to step in and take responsibility, even though maybe someone else should, even though maybe it's more someone else's job? Where do you need to say, I'm him, I'm her, and take over? To have that here I am, send me attitude. I will do this. I will take responsibility. I am up to the challenge. I think there are a lot of places in our lives where we can feel justified saying, not my job, someone else's responsibility. And you can feel okay about yourself. But as Christians, we're called to something higher. As Christ followers, we're called to something higher. As members of the body of Christ, we need you to step up. We need you to take responsibility, even though you feel like it's really someone else's job. It's time for you to be a leader. Where is that for you? Where is God shining a light on that area where you need to step up and be a leader? And I'll say, a lot of y'all are doing that. I think there's some cool things going on. I think there's some cool things coming up in the spring. I think we got some good things going on because people are willing to do that. So I will say thank you for that. And we're going to offer an invitation. And as we do that, and as we think about owning it, as we think about taking responsibility, I want to remind you, that's what our God did. Our God takes responsibility for things he should not have to be responsible for. And there's no better example of that than seeing Christ on the cross. Taking responsibility for sins that weren't his. Something he should not have to do. But he took responsibility and he did it. Taking responsibility for damage he didn't do. He took that on. He was a servant leader. He took responsibility for me and for you on the cross. And if you want to thank him for that, if you want to receive forgiveness, if you want to identify yourself with that sacrifice through baptism, or if you need any other prayers or encouragement from your congregation, we're here with you and we want to encourage you. So we invite you to come now as together we stand and sing.